Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the program. Today we're going to talk about Lake Titicaca and Tiwanaku, the ancient culture that predated the Inca around the Bolivia and Peru region. Actually, there's been, if you're not familiar with the debate that goes on around this time period of probably around 2,000 plus years, as you may or may not know, a lot of the Mayans and all these ancient cultures of South America and Central America, a lot of them are dated fairly recently compared to other things such as like the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians and other stuff in the Middle East. Part of that is still being, I guess you can say, negotiated or worked out between various academics. The oldest, so for instance, one of the oldest radiocarbon dates they have for the Tiwanaku culture, the culture around, or the state around Lake Titicaca, is roughly, I think, 200 BC, around there, 300 BC, something like that. Although there have been some reports of other things going back like 1800 BC or 1000 BC. The point is that there's a lot of ambiguity there, whether there's a vested interest of various academics wanting to keep the dates within that range, such as some Egyptologists do within their respective field. The fact of the matter is that there is this argument, this debate going on as to how old and how far back the civilizations and the ancient civilizations of the Central and South Americans go back. Some people think it's 5,000 BC, and some people think it's even further than that. So I thought this article is very interesting because it doesn't really shed light on how old everything is. What I mean by that is it's not pushing any dates back, but there are some things about it that can be put up for debate. Some of the dates that are used are, again, they're not set in stone, but it's just consensus, and consensus doesn't necessarily mean truth. So what we have on the screen is just a map of Lake Titicaca, and of course we have all these cities and all these places, these modern places. Some interesting facts about Lake Titicaca is it's very high. I think it's the highest and largest lake in South America, period. And it's about 3,800 meters above sea level, and it's situated in a basin within the Andes mountain range. And the basin itself is very interesting, and it does make for an ideal place to start a civilization. So right away we have this, I guess you can say, Three Little Bears scenario, the Goldilocks scenario, where you have fresh water and you have a basin and you have a lot of biodiversity and all limitless possibilities to farm and live off the land and such. So these are all the required recipes to have a long-lasting civilization that's free to do stuff like animal sacrifice and ritual worshipping gods and trade and all of these things that come with relative affluence. I'm just prefacing the whole article with this so you guys have a better idea, especially if you don't know much about this region. Archaeologists discover exceptional site at Lake Titicaca. So this is an underwater archaeological find. And again, these guys were just tipped off by local divers who came upon some of these things. And then the archaeologists went in there and they found a bunch of different relics that are in near mint condition almost. I mean, as far as archaeological standards go. And so this place is underwater. They found these ritual offerings, remains of slaughtered animals from this reef in the middle of Lake Titicaca. So one of the things that they highlighted was this clear picture of these religious ceremonies that they did. And like I mentioned before, these are supposed to be pretty relative, like within 2,000 years ago, that they were doing this. So it seems like a very, very complex and rich religion that they were practicing it must not have started with them, just because of how elaborate these ceremonies were, and the fact that they still survive to this day. The history is highly charged ceremonies in which the elite of the region's Tiwanaku state boated out of the reef and sacrificed young llamas. They decorated for death, and then they made offerings of gold and stone miniatures to a ray-faced deity as incense billowed from pottery pumas. So one thing that I thought, and I'm not the only one to make these parallels. A bunch of people have made parallels and written books connecting the ceremonies and traditions of ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia to the civilizations in southern and Central America. And there's a lot of parallels, and there's a lot of similar, like pyramids, similar architecture. These very, very similar ideas floating around in two completely separate regions. So a lot of people have drawn not a conclusion, but a highly likely possibility that the two places were connected, even though they're oceans apart. They were some sort of network that kept them in touch somehow. And you can see it in their ritual. And although the dates don't line up, that's part of this argument that's going on, is how could you have all these parallels cannot be a coincidence. So we've got to look into the dating, because if these datings are just too young. In terms of the Incas and stuff, well, that dating's not off, because the Spanish have records from the 15th and 16th century of interacting with those guys. But those guys, the Incas, they took over the Tiwanaku state, that civilization that was there, that group of people. And they even had a language. Now I think it's called Aymara, but Aymara actually, it's heavily speculated it comes from the Tiwanaku people, and then whoever the Tiwanaku people came from, they must have had a language or something as well, or some sort of code of ethics, something abstract that they followed, such like a god, right? Like they don't, or an idea of the afterlife, if you want to take it that far back. What I'm trying to say is that there's this long tradition that can be traced up until around 2,000 years ago. Then it gets kind of murky, and then suddenly there's this huge debate. So that, again, I'm just making you aware of what's going on in terms of that conversation that's going on right now in academia. So between the 5th and 12th centuries AD, this is where it dates to, this Tiwanaku state in the Lake Titicaca basin, which again must be host to, at one point in time, must have been host to about 1 million people. And that's really interesting, because up until that was discovered, people thought that the maximum population around this area was about 20,000 to 30,000 people. But now that it's out there, people are starting to accept the idea that, hey, this must have been a mega city. This must have been not only a mildly successful group of people, but I mean, they reached 1 million people landmark in that small basin alone. And let me pull up a map here. So this is a entire basin here, but then Lake Titicaca is here, and you can see this is a language map, the Aymara language distribution map, and you can see why they would think that this language would trace back to these people that preceded them. It's because it comes out of this area. I mean, they must have been speaking something, right? Where did this language come from them? How could this language have supplanted the other one if it didn't have some sort of connection to it in the first place? And so here's territories between the Wari and the Tiwanaku people. So you can see that in the blue, the Tiwanaku people held this. They had sole possession, essentially, of this lake. And here, this is the Gate of the Sun. It's centrally located on the Island of the Sun, which is inside the lake itself. And here's an aerial view of the lake, really interesting. And this is the Island of the Sun right here, almost in the center. Very interesting stuff. So anyway, and this is a picture of the basin here itself, so you can see this topographical map here. Anyway, so this place is formed by a natural fault that divides the Andes into two mountain ranges. So the basin is a unique ecosystem with an inland sea. So unique ecosystem. I think there's a few species of frogs there that's unique only to there. It's really, really mysterious, and it's really deep. The lake is unusually deep as well. So whenever there's depth, there's usually some sort of mystery there. Who knows what's at the bottom of the lake too. I did an episode on underwater archaeology, actually. It's one of my earlier episodes, where it was about a team of divers that were trying to map the entire floor, which is a monumental task in and of itself. So they go to this reef where these amateur divers tipped off these marine archaeologists, and it's submerged in more than 5 meters of water, northwestern tip of the Island of the Sun. So again, the Island of the Sun, when you go there, you have the vantage point of seeing pretty much everything within the basin. And because of that, it undoubtedly must have been a ritual site held in high regard by the people occupying it. With that in mind, it makes a lot more sense that they would find all these precious stones, jewelry, remains of these sacrifices, gold. A lot was going on here that was very, very significant to their culture. So some of the stuff they excavated were lapis lazuli puma figurine, other miniature stone animals, ceramic puma incense burners, gold ornaments, engraved sheets, medallions, L-shaped piece marked with a puma and condor silhouette. So you get a lot of this animal. I don't know if they're anthropomorphic or if they're a mix. It doesn't say anything about that, but the puma seems to be a very, very important figure in their culture, in their belief system. And again, guys, you don't get this. This just doesn't spring up out of nothing. It doesn't come and go. These types of architecture, making miniature stone figurines and accumulating precious jewelry, and then have the ability to conceive of sacrificing to a greater being, a god. This has to be derived from some sort of long-standing tradition. And that, to me, is one of the strongest arguments without having concrete carbon datable evidence. Because that, of course, that's really hard to come by. But these people didn't just come out of thin air 2,000 or so years ago. They came from somewhere. And I think that's starting to bear itself out over time with discoveries such as this. Besides the gold and the carved polished stones were spiny oyster shells from warm waters off the Ecuadorian coast, nearly 2,000 kilometers away, that could have only been obtained through trade. So they traveled 2,000 kilometers. They found things that had traveled 2,000 kilometers from Ecuador, which is way north of where Lake Titicaca is, and these oyster shells from these warm waters must have been highly sought out by the people here, because obviously they live so far away. So they also had an established trade network. That in and of itself, how do you get to that point in such a short amount of time? That does not make a lot of sense. And you pair this in mind with how cruel the Spanish were when they came through. They destroyed all these relics, all these idols, and they stamped out so many different people that it's not surprising that now that as we look back at that time, that everything is just so out of whack, and we have no sense of the timeline of this period. We just have a very primitive, still to this day, a very primitive understanding of anything even 1,000 years from back. Not even BC, not even super ancient like the Mesopotamians. We might get there. We just got to find a smoking gun, and there are arguably smoking guns out there, depending on who you ask. But there are no hard carbon dates that date a specific civilization to this area no further than like 2000, 3000 BC, and that is being very, very generous. What is great about these artifacts is that beyond their beauty and quality, they were discovered in an undisturbed context. So yeah, it's good that the marine archaeology is really a good way to go if you want to find anything, because just by the nature of how it's being preserved underwater, it's very hard to grave rob something underwater, So it has like a natural protection from that. A lot of types of erosion. It doesn't get beat down from rain or the rays of the sun or wind erosion. It's just underwater, and it just gets moss and eventually it will, but it has a way longer shelf life. It'll last. Carbon dating of charcoal and bones at the site found that the offerings were made throughout the 8th and 10th centuries AD. So again, this is what survived, but what they were practicing, look at what they were practicing. They were practicing this ancient religion well into the 8th and 10th centuries. Very interesting. So here's a few pictures of what they found. And again, they're in remarkable shape. This is remarkable. And this is not rudimentary. This is not super primitive. This is pretty advanced for what we originally thought these people were. One of the major questions surrounding Tiwanaku is how it expanded so effectively across the Titicaca Basin in the first millennium. Charles Stanish, an anthropologist from the University of South Florida, said pilgrimages leading up to elaborate ceremonies were a crucial part of the state structure. Through ritual, religion, and supernatural punishers, the state encouraged cooperation and deterred freeloaders and other rebels. So they had their own version of truth. This is their tradition. This is what they thought was supposed to happen. This is what they created a civilization around as their backbone to function. Like the reason why they got to that point was to be able to worship their gods. And that mission, if you want to call it, that goal or that state of mind that they had in that time period is really hard to foster. Again, you don't just become a warlord and kill everybody and subjugate them, and then they're suddenly following this what looks to be a very complicated religion. I mean, this you don't do that overnight. Like Genghis Khan wasn't going to be able to do that. He was a great warlord, but he wasn't going to be able to build these huge altars and these have this huge repository of knowledge about the cosmos and then create things on the ground to reflect what's in space. Like he wasn't doing any of that. He was just trying to expand. But these guys, they had some sort of, whatever you want to call it, logos, religious structure, and a code of ethics, whatever it was that kept them on that path. As you participate in them, you are reinforcing the power of the state. Yeah, that's what Stanish is basically saying. These pilgrimages and these rituals were part of the state apparatus. It was almost like law, but it was understood amongst everybody involved. And it must have been a popular and flourishing state because, again, they think 1 million people live there. They have these trade networks that extend further than 2,000 kilometers. They're trading. They have all kinds of wealth going on, a lot of commerce. So seems like the hallmarks of a very successful civilization of its time. The discovery of these items on the reef shows us there was probably a series of pilgrimages or processions around the lake. That's very interesting as well. The lake must have been, they must have held it as something divine, as maybe how we, some people from the Christian or the Judeo-Christian faith, they see Jerusalem, right? It's like the holiest of the holies, the holy ground. Well, they must have seen this Island of the Sun or the Lake Titicaca itself as divine as well, because otherwise why would they have all these rituals right there? More than a dozen Tiwanaku sites have been found on the Island of the Sun. Very interesting. Puma-shaped ceremonial complex, and then the reef that they found it, which again is in the northwestern part of the island, would have a panoramic view of the lake and spectacular surrounding mountains. I mentioned that earlier. It's not surprising that the elite appropriated this space for costly and highly charged ceremonies. So they had an elite that were basically presiding over all these movements, all of these events, these processions, and they must have been following this ideology that, again, must be older than we think it is. Ritual and religion structured people's lives, much as it does today. It structured the economy and the whole of society. So this is how people were able to create spectacular ways to get along and have a very successful society. So that's very important, right? How do and they probably would have continued it if it weren't for the Incas, probably, or even the Spanish. You can go further. The Incas probably would have done the same thing, because they were also doing sacrifice. They were also they also had an empire that spanned. They had trade networks, and they had the empire that spanned large distances. Just continuing what was going on. I'm pretty sure the Tiwanaku, the people who preceded the Tiwanaku people, also had some sort of expansion period. So, again, if you guys have any knowledge about this or anything else you want to add, let me know in the comments. I would love to see more comments. Hit the thumbs up button, please. Share the video, or share this video on Twitter or something. Ask me questions on Twitter or in the comments, and I'll try to address them. But yeah, I thought this was interesting. Or is it? Yeah, and this is a sphere of influence that these people, the Tiwanaku culture, probably had, starting from Lake Titicaca and then out. So they were successful to a very, very large, to a very high degree, and they had a very large sphere of influence. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you guys later.